In this case study, I'm going to talk more about exploratory data analysis techniques and how to use them on a data set that involves using smartphones to kind of predict human activities. So remember, just in any exploratory data analysis, you have to have a sense of kind of like what you're looking for, what might be the kind of the key priorities that you want to get out of your data set. And so that will help you guide kind of what you look at and how you approach it. Remember, the basic idea with exploratory data analysis is you want to kind of produce a rough cut of the kind of analysis that you ultimately maybe want to do. So maybe this isn't going to be perfect. It's not going to have all the right bells and whistles to it, but it's going to give you a rough idea of kind of what kind of information you're going to be able to extract out of your data set and what kinds of questions you're going to be able to feasibly answer and what questions might not really be possible to answer with the given data set. So exploratory data analysis is really important because it rules out certain questions and it kind of pushes you along other directions, and it really allows you to give you that rough cut analysis that can take you to the next step. So let's take a look at the Samsung data set in this example and see what we can find. So the data set here comes from the University of California, Irvine, or the UCI Machine Learning Archive, and it's based on predicting people's movements from their Galaxy Samsung Galaxy phones. So here's a picture of the Samsung Galaxy S3. The actual data set was produced using the Galaxy S2, but the idea is kind of basically the same. So in each of these phones, there's an accelerometer and a gyroscope, and so it helps you kind of to understand the kind of three-dimensional position and acceleration of a person, assuming that they're holding their phone. So this is where the data set comes from. This is the UCI Machine Learning Repository. You can go to the link to learn a little bit more about the data set, how it was collected, and kind of what is available on the website. And so I've downloaded a subset of the data, which is just the training data set for the purposes of this lecture. So the data has been processed a little bit to make it a little bit easier to use. But basically, you get a matrix that has the observations on the rows and the various features on the columns. And you can see that at the bottom here, I've got the activity label, which is for each row, it tells you what the person was doing at that time. And so, for example, there's 6 possible activities that you can be doing. There's laying, sitting, standing, walking down, and walking up. And the idea is that you want to be able to kind of separate out these 6 activities based on the many features that are collected by the accelerometer and the gyroscope. And so I listed the first 12 features here. You can see that there's body acceleration, there's the mean, the standard deviation, the mean absolute deviation, and the maximum of each of these features. So one thing we can do really quickly is just look at the average acceleration for the first subject. So the first thing I'm going to do is just convert the activity variable into a factor variable, and then using the transform function. And then I'm going to just subset out the first subject, so subject equals 1. And for the rest of this presentation, I'm just going to ignore the rest of the subjects for the moment. And so if I plot the first subject, I can look at the first column. And that's the first column is the mean body acceleration in the x direction. So the acceleration is kind of divided into 3 dimensions, x, y, and z. And then the second plot here is going to be the mean body acceleration in the y direction. And I've color coded each of the activities by I've color coded each of the activities. And so you can see, for example, on the left-hand plot that there's green, there's red, black, blue, and so all for different activities. But part of the problem with the left-hand plot is you can't tell which activity is which. So on the right-hand plot, I added a legend using the legend function, just so you can figure out kind of which activities correspond to which color. And so you can see that the green is standing, the red is sitting, and the black is laying, etc. And so you can see that, for example, the mean body acceleration is relatively uninteresting for things like standing and sitting and laying, but for things like walking and walking down and walking up, there's much more variability in the mean body acceleration for the x direction. We can try to cluster the data just on the average acceleration. So I've taken just the first 3 columns of this matrix, and I calculated a distance matrix using the dist function, and I'm using a Euclidean distance just as the default. And I can call the hclust function to do a hierarchical clustering of these data. And I've called this my plclust function just to visualize it. You can see that the clustering is a little bit messy, and there isn't any kind of clear pattern going on. All the colors are kind of jumbled together at the bottom. And so we might need to look a little bit further to try to kind of extract more information out of here. So another thing we can look at is the maximum acceleration for the first subject here. And so I'm plotting here columns 10 and 11. And so you can see that column 10 is the maximum body acceleration in the x direction, and column 11 is the maximum body acceleration in the y direction. And so you can see that, again, for things like laying and standing and sitting, there's not a lot of interesting things going on, but for walking and walking up and walking down, the maximum acceleration shows a lot of variability. So that may be a predictor of those kinds of activities, but maybe or at least separating kind of not moving from moving, which might be kind of obvious in retrospect. So if you cluster the data based on maximum acceleration, you can see that there's two very clear clusters. On the left-hand side, you've got the kind of the various walking activities, and on the right-hand side, you've got the various non-moving activities, laying, standing, and sitting. And so, but then beyond that, things are a little bit jumbled together. You can see that there's a lot of turquoise on the left, and so that's clearly one activity. But then the blue and the kind of magenta kind of mixed together. And so clustering based on maximum acceleration seems to separate out kind of moving from non-moving. But then once you get within those clusters, like for example, within the moving cluster or within the non-moving cluster, then it's a little bit hard to tell kind of what is what, based just on maximum acceleration. We can try a little singular value decomposition on this data just to explore what's going on. Now, before I do the SVD, I'm going to do it on the entire matrix, which is 560 some columns. But I'm going to remove the last two because the last two columns are just the activity identifier and the subject identifier, which are not really interesting data. So I get rid of the columns 562 and 63, and then I run the SVD on the data. And you can see I'll take a look at the first and the second left singular vectors. And color code them by activity. And again, you can kind of see there's a similar type of pattern. The first singular vector really seems to separate out the moving from the non-moving. So you can see that there's the kind of the green, red, black on the bottom, and the blue, turquoise, magenta on the top. And then the second singular vector is a little bit a little bit more vague. What it's looking at, it seems to be separating out the magenta color from all the other clusters. And so I think this is the walking down or walking up, one of those two. And so it's not clear what is different about that kind of gets highlighted on the second singular vector here. So one of the things we can try to do is try to find the maximum contributor, the contributor. So in the second singular vector, in the second right singular vector, we can try to figure out, well, which of these features is kind of producing the most variation, or is contributing to the most to the variation between the different observations. And so we can use the which.max function to figure out, okay, well, which of the 500 so features corresponds to the kind of the largest or contributes most to the variation across observations. And I'll save that to an object called maxcontrib. And then I'll cluster based on the maximum acceleration plus this extra feature, and I'll calculate the distance matrix, run the hclust function, and you can see now the kind of the various activities seem to be separating out a little bit more. At least the three movement activities have clearly been separated. You've got the magenta, the dark blue, and the turquoise all separated out. The various non-moving activities seem to be all kind of mixed together too. So whatever this maximum contributor happened to be, it didn't really help to separate out the non-moving activities, but it seemed to help a lot in terms of separating out the movement activities. So this max contributor was the body acceleration, the mean body acceleration in the frequency domain for the z direction. And so this is kind of the body acceleration for the z direction where they applied a fast Fourier transform, and they give you the kind of frequency components from that. So that's kind of interesting. We can try another clustering technique here, which is k-means clustering. And one of the things about k-means clustering that you have to be a little bit careful about is that you can get kind of different answers depending on how many starting values you've tried, and how often you run it. So when you start k-means, it has to choose a starting point for where the cluster centers are, and often most algorithms will just choose a random starting point. So if you choose a random starting point, you may get to a solution that's suboptimal. So if you choose a different starting point, you may get to an even better solution. And so it's usually good to set the end start argument to be more than one, so you can try many different starting points just so you can get the optimal or a more optimal solution. So here is one clustering that we've done with k-means, and you can see that I specified 6 centers, so I know that there are 6 clusters, so I'll just specify them right away. And you can see that some of the clusters kind of jumble together, so you can see cluster 3 is a combination of laying, sitting, and standing, whereas cluster 1 is clearly walking, cluster 2 is walking down, cluster 4 is walking up, cluster 5 is just walking, and cluster 6 is a mixture of laying, sitting, and standing. And so you can see that the k-means here had trouble separating out also the laying, sitting, and standing from the 3 different in the clusters. If we try it again, you can see the arrangement's a little bit different, but again, cluster 2, for example, is a mixture of laying, sitting, and standing. Cluster 5, similarly, a mixture of sitting and standing. But the other clusters the other activities seem to cluster out very easily. So now, if we tried 100 different starting values and take the optimal solution from these 100. You see that things seem to separate out a little bit better, not much better than last time. You can see cluster 1 is a mixture, again, of laying, sitting, and standing. Cluster 2 is clearly laying. Cluster 3 is clearly walking. And cluster 4 is walking down, etc. So you can see how these things kind of cluster together. And we'll do a second try with 100 starting values. And you can see this is probably going to be our best effort. And cluster 6 still is a mixture of 3 activities. And cluster 5 is a mixture of 2. So you can see we can see where the kind of cluster centers are, and the idea is that each of the clusters has a mean value or a center in this 500-dimensional space, and so we can see kind of which features of these 500 features seem to drive the location of the center for that given cluster, and that will help give us some idea of what features seem to be important for classifying people in that cluster or classifying observations in that cluster. So in the first cluster here, which seems to correspond to laying, you can see that the center has a relatively high value or positive values for the first 3 features, which is kind of the mean body acceleration, and then low values for some of the other features, features 4 through 10. I'm only plotting the first 10 here of the 500 or so. And then you can see the second cluster here. It corresponds a little bit more, has some more interesting values for other features. So there's there's kind of mean acceleration. There's also the kind of max acceleration, which seems to have a kind of some interesting values. And so one of the things you can do by looking at the cluster centers is to see, what features seem to have interesting values that kind of drive the location of that center, and which could give you a hint in terms of what features will be most useful for predicting that activity. So this was just a short demonstration to show how you can take a large data set with lots of features and lots of observations and start to explore it a little bit with various clustering techniques. We use hierarchical clustering, we use k-means clustering, and we use the singular value decomposition to look at various features of this data set. So given what we've learned here, we may want to be interested in following up on kind of what separates out the various non-movement activities. So in terms of laying, sitting, and standing, it had seemed to have some difficulty, at least on the first glance, separating those 3 activities out. The movement activities in terms of walking, walking up, and walking down, we seem to be able to kind of separate those out into separate clusters using just a few variables, mostly the max acceleration variables. But the non-movement kind of activities seem to be harder to separate out. So the nice thing about the exploratory data analysis is that it gives you this rough cut. It tells you kind of where to spend your energy. So we probably may not have to spend too much energy on the movement activities, but maybe you need to dig a little bit deeper looking at the kind of non-movement activities. So I hope you find this useful in terms of how to get started using clustering techniques and how to take a look at the data and to kind of further your analysis to kind of get you going for a more formal analysis.